Imagine a country where every dollar earned above a million is taxed at 90%. The headlines scream. The politicians cheer. The public celebrates what they believe is the ultimate cure for inequality. But then something silent begins to happen. Capital evaporates. Investments freeze. The very engine of the economy starts to stall. This isn't a dystopian novel. It's a mathematical reality that governments have ignored for decades. We've been sold a simple story. Tax the rich, solve the deficit, fund the future. But money doesn't obey speeches, it obeys incentives. And when the pressure crosses a hidden threshold, the system doesn't just bend, it breaks. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the most misunderstood economic lever in modern history. What happens when you push taxation too far? Why do billionaires never actually pay what they owe on paper? And what are the invisible limits that no political campaign will ever admit exist? Stay with me, because the answers will change how you see wealth, power, and the fragile architecture of the modern economy. Welcome to a deep dive that strips away the political theater and examines the raw mechanics of wealth extraction. For over a century, policymakers have treated taxation as a dial. Turn it up, collect more. Turn it down, collect less. It's an appealing illusion, one that sounds logical, until you study what actually happens when capital meets compounding pressure. The wealthy don't just write checks. They deploy assets, restructure liabilities, and navigate legal frameworks that most citizens never even know exist. This video isn't about defending privilege or attacking redistribution. It's about understanding boundaries. Every system has a breaking point. Forests burn when the heat exceeds moisture retention. Markets collapse when liquidity dries up. And taxation reaches its mathematical limit when the cost of compliance and capital flight outweighs the revenue extracted. We'll walk through 5 critical dimensions of this reality. Historical precedents that shattered under their own weight. The mechanical architecture of tax avoidance that operates legally. The behavioral economics of wealth that turns policy into unintended consequences. The global chessboard that turns nations into competitors for mobile capital. And finally, the structural alternatives that actually work when brute force taxation fails. By the end of this journey, you won't just understand the limits of taxing the rich. You'll understand why every economy that ignores them pays the price in stagnation, black markets, or quiet decline. The math doesn't lie. The incentives don't negotiate. And the truth is rarely comfortable. Let's begin where every policy debate starts, with the illusion of control. History is littered with governments that believed they could outtax their own economies. In the 1970s and 80s, several Western nations pushed marginal income tax rates past 70%, some even reaching 90%. The political promise was simple. Extract more, redistribute more, heal the divide. The economic reality was brutal. High statutory rates didn't translate into high collections. They translated into capital flight, offshore incorporation, and a thriving underground economy where wealth simply disappeared from official ledgers. Enter the Laffer curve, named not as a political manifesto but as a mathematical observation. It proposes a fundamental relationship between tax rates and revenue. At 0%, you collect nothing. At 100%, you also collect nothing, because no one produces or reports income. Between those extremes lies a peak, a point where revenue is maximized before behavioral adjustments begin to erode the base. The controversy isn't whether the curve exists. The controversy is where the peak sits. Economists argue it shifts with technology, globalization, and enforcement capacity. But one principle remains unshakable. Once rates cross a certain threshold, compliance drops faster than the rate increases. Look at France's 75% millionaire tax. Introduced in 2012 with great fanfare, it was quietly abandoned 3 years later. Why? Because the wealthiest citizens didn't just pay less. They left. Belgium became a destination. Swiss cantons adjusted their brackets to attract them, and the French treasury lost more in corporate relocation and consumption decline than it ever collected from the top bracket. The policy didn't just miss its target, it inverted it. The lesson isn't that taxes don't work. The lesson is that taxation operates within human behavior, and human behavior optimizes for survival. When the cost of staying exceeds the cost of leaving, capital moves. When capital moves, infrastructure shrinks. When infrastructure shrinks, the middle class absorbs the hidden tax of reduced services, lower wages, and inflated living costs. The curve doesn't care about ideology. It cares about equilibrium, and equilibrium always wins. Let's dismantle the myth that billionaires operate in a different legal universe because of corruption. The truth is more structural. They operate in a different accounting universe because of complexity. Wealth at scale isn't a salary. It's a network of holding companies, trusts, depreciation schedules, and unrealized gains that never trigger a taxable event. When politicians demand higher income taxes on the rich, they're targeting a metric that barely applies to actual wealth accumulation. Income is what you earn in a year, wealth is what compounds across decades, and the tax code is built around income, not net worth. That creates a fundamental mismatch. You can have $10 billion in equity and zero taxable income if the assets don't pay out as dividends or aren't sold. This isn't a loophole. It's the architecture of modern capital. Real estate investors use depreciation to offset rental income. Tech founders take loans against stock holdings instead of selling shares. Families use irrevocable trusts to shift depreciation across generations while minimizing estate triggers. Every mechanism is legal, every mechanism is documented, and every mechanism responds directly to tax pressure by becoming more sophisticated. The higher the statutory rate, the greater the incentive to hire legal teams that specialize in tax efficiency. We're not talking about hidden vaults. We're talking about public filings, Delaware LLCs, Puerto Rico incentives, and international treaty networks that legally reroute economic activity. Capital flight doesn't always mean moving to a tropical island. Sometimes it means moving a headquarters from New York to Austin or from London to Dublin. The geographic shift is smaller. The economic impact is identical. When jurisdictions push too hard, mobile capital migrates to softer friction. And what remains behind? Immobile assets, middle-income earners, and consumption-based economies that suddenly face higher effective rates because the tax base has shrunk. The system doesn't collapse. It recalibrates. And the recalibration always favors those who understand the mechanics over those who only understand the rhetoric. That's why chasing statutory rates without addressing the underlying structure of wealth creation is like trying to fill a leaking bucket by turning up the faucet. Taxation doesn't just extract money. It extracts motivation. And motivation is the invisible fuel of economic expansion. When marginal rates climb past a psychological threshold, behavior changes in ways that spreadsheets rarely capture. Entrepreneurs delay exits. Founders reduce hiring. Investors shift from productive risk to defensive preservation. This isn't about greed. It's about risk adjustment. Every dollar reinvested into a business carries the probability of failure. Every dollar taken as tax is certain. When the certainty of extraction outweighs the probability of reward, capital stops building and starts hiding. Consider the secondary effects. Higher taxes on high earners don't just reduce their consumption. They reduce the velocity of money through local economies. Premium real estate softens. Luxury service sectors contract. Specialized labor markets lose demand. The ripple effect travels downward faster than most models predict. And when revenue projections rely on static scoring, instead of dynamic behavioral response, the shortfall becomes inevitable. There's also the compliance paradox. Complex tax systems don't just burden the wealthy. They burden the bureaucracy that administers them. Enforcement costs rise. Audits multiply. Legal challenges drain public coffers. And the net yield shrinks under the weight of its own machinery. Meanwhile, small businesses that lack sophisticated advisory teams face disproportionate friction. They pay what they owe, not because they want to, but because they can't afford to structure around it. The result is a two-tier economy, one that navigates and one that complies. And yet, the most overlooked behavioral shift is innovation pacing. When after-tax returns on venture capital drop, the risk premium rises. Investors demand higher multiples to fund early-stage companies. Fewer projects get greenlit, breakthroughs slow. The long-term growth curve flattens. Tax policy doesn't just redistribute today's wealth. It shapes tomorrow's productivity. Ignore that, and you're not funding the future, you're borrowing against it. The economy doesn't stall because people refuse to work. It stalls because the incentive to build new things becomes mathematically inferior to the incentive to preserve what already exists. And preservation never creates jobs. It only manages decline. Capital no longer respects borders. It respects efficiency. In a world where intellectual property can be licensed across jurisdictions in minutes, where digital services bypass physical infrastructure, and where remote work decouples labor from geography, taxation has become a competitive product. Nations don't just levy taxes. They sell residency. They market corporate environments. They negotiate treaties that determine where value is recognized and where it is taxed. When one country raises its top marginal rate, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It broadcasts a price increase to every mobile dollar watching from abroad. Look at the corporate tax landscape. Ireland's 15% rate didn't happen by accident. It was engineered to attract headquarters, research centers, and intellectual property registrations. The United Arab Emirates operates with zero personal income tax and strategically structured corporate fees to pull talent and capital into free zones. Singapore balances low rates with world-class infrastructure to become a wealth management hub. None of these models are hiding in shadows. They're published on government websites, They're audited by international bodies, they're perfectly legal. And when traditional economies attempt to counter them with punitive taxation, the result isn't a moral victory, it's capital relocation. The wealthy don't abandon wealth. They relocate the legal domicile of wealth. The economic activity follows. The tax base follows. And the originating country is left with higher statutory rates and lower actual collections, while still bearing the fixed costs of public infrastructure that funded the original growth. This isn't a race to the bottom, it's a race to efficiency. Jurisdictions that align taxation with service delivery, legal predictability, and regulatory clarity win. Those that treat taxation as punishment lose. The global system has adapted to mobility. Policy that ignores mobility is policy designed for a world that no longer exists. When you tax wealth as if it's trapped in a jar, you forget that wealth flows like water. It finds the path of least resistance, and resistance, at scale, becomes evaporation. The lesson isn't that governments should surrender revenue. The lesson is that revenue must be optimized for retention, not just extraction. Otherwise, you're not building a treasury. You're funding an exodus. If brute force taxation hits hard limits, what actually works? The answer isn't simpler. It's structural. Sustainable revenue comes from broadening bases, closing behavioral gaps, and aligning incentives with long-term productivity. Consumption-based taxation, when designed with progressive offsets, captures wealth at the moment of deployment without penalizing reinvestment. Land value taxation targets unproductive speculation while leaving productive development untouched. Financial transaction taxes, calibrated to avoid market distortion, can generate revenue from high-frequency activity that otherwise escapes traditional income metrics. The real breakthrough isn't raising rates, it's improving visibility. When unrealized gains remain invisible, taxation remains theoretical. Mark-to-market frameworks, carefully phased, bring appreciation into the taxable sphere without forcing asset liquidation. International information sharing, like the OECD's global reporting standards, shrinks the opacity that fuels aggressive avoidance, and simplifying the code reduces the premium placed on tax engineering over actual economic contribution. These aren't political fantasies. They're engineering solutions. They treat the economy as a system, not a ledger, and systems respond to design, not pressure. When you stop trying to extract more from a shrinking base and start expanding the base itself, the math flips. Broader participation, clearer rules, lower friction, higher compliance. That's how revenue scales sustainably. That's how inequality is addressed without triggering capital flight or stagnation. But there's a final limit that no policy can override: human patience. Taxation requires legitimacy. When citizens perceive the system as unfair, arbitrary, or punitive, compliance fractures. When governments overpromise and underdeliver, trust erodes. And without trust, enforcement becomes coercion. Coercion breeds evasion. Evasion shrinks revenue. The cycle repeats. The limit of taxing the rich isn't just economic. It's social. It's the boundary where policy becomes self-defeating, because it forgets that economies are made of people, not percentages. We've walked through the historical records that shattered under excessive rates. We've mapped the legal architecture that turns wealth into mobile capital. We've examined the behavioral shifts that flatten growth when incentives invert. We've traced the global competition that treats taxation as a pricing strategy, and we've outlined the structural alternatives that align revenue with reality. The limit of taxing the rich isn't a conspiracy, it's a constraint, and constraints aren't meant to be broken. They're meant to be understood. Every economy operates within boundaries. Push too hard, and you don't extract more. You extract differently. You shift the burden to those who can't move. You shrink the base you rely on. You trade short-term headlines for long-term decline. That's not ideology. That's arithmetic. The goal shouldn't be to tax wealth into submission. It should be to design systems where wealth creation and public funding coexist, where mobility is acknowledged, not punished, where transparency replaces opacity, where incentives build instead of preserve. The richest societies aren't the ones that extract the most. They're the ones that optimize the most. The next time a politician promises that higher rates alone will fix the deficit, ask the harder question. Ask what happens after the rate passes. Ask where the capital goes. Ask who actually pays when the base shrinks. The answers will always point back to the same truth. You can't tax what leaves. You can't build what you don't understand. And you can't sustain what you keep breaking. If this breakdown shifted how you see wealth, policy, and economic limits, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, but it tells the algorithm that deep, unfiltered analysis still matters. Subscribe to this channel if you're tired of surface-level finance content and want the mechanics behind the headlines. We don't do slogans, we do systems. And now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below with your take. Do you believe broadening the tax base is more effective than raising rates? Or do you think wealth caps should be enforced regardless of capital mobility? Lay out your reasoning. I read every single thread, and the most insightful perspectives get featured in our next deep dive. Share this video with someone who argues about taxes without understanding the mechanics. Knowledge shouldn't stay locked behind jargon. It should move. It should challenge. It should scale. Thank you for investing 30 minutes into understanding the architecture of modern wealth. I'll see you in the next breakdown. The conversation doesn't end when the video stops. It begins when you apply the framework to what you read next, what you vote for, and what you expect from economic policy. Demand clarity over complexity. Demand sustainability over spectacle. Demand systems that work for reality, not rhetoric. Keep questioning the surface. Keep mapping the mechanics. Keep building the kind of financial literacy that turns noise into signal. The limits exist. The solutions exist. The only missing piece is the willingness to look past the headline and understand the machinery. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and keep following the money.